I'm going to give a little bit of background about the What Works Center. We have with us Dr. Anna Valero from the London School of Economics. She's a senior policy fellow there, and she'll be talking to us about the work she's done on green investments and the impact on jobs and innovation. She'll probably talk for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then Henry Overman, who's the director of the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth, will draw out some of the local issues and some other pertinent issues for everyone after that. And then we'll, as I say, we'll take questions. Put your questions in the chat box, and I will, I'll read through them and ask people to sort of unmute themselves and ask their questions themselves, or I can ask them for you if you prefer. The plan was to run until 3:30, and that's probably what we'll do. But if we can finish early, we will. It's always nice to get a little bit of time back. We'll see how it goes. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the What Works Center for Local Economic Growth for those who are new to us. We've been around for about 7 years, and we're part of the government's sort of stable of What Works organizations. Our job is to pull together all of the evidence on what works using rigorous evaluation. And we've pulled together evidence from sort of all across the world about what different places have done and what seems to have had the best impact on growing their local economy, especially in terms of jobs, in terms of employment, and in terms of wages and also productivity. Those are the things that are most important to us as outcomes, because we think those are the things that have the greatest impact on a place. We have a wide variety of resources on our website, and I just wanted to mention two that are particularly timely right now that people might be interested in. The first one is about COVID recovery. We've been working on this issue, obviously, like everyone else, has been working on nothing else for the past year, and we have a number of papers on our website that you can look at. Many of them will lead into workshops over the next 6 months that we're doing along this sort of style. So we've covered high streets, youth unemployment, data sources. We've also done some work on business support and just how to think about major economic shocks and how you might respond to them. So all that stuff is on our website, and you can have a look at that. And if you want to join us in one of the workshops that we're having over the next few months, you can do some pre-reading if you're really keen. The other thing I'm going to tell you. Sorry. The other thing I want to mention is the towns funds. If any of you are from places that are getting towns fund funding, we're running a special project for 10 to 12 places on towns fund issues, particularly around evidence and evaluation and how it relates to the town's funds. It's particularly important right now, I think, that we look at this, given that there are a number of funds coming forward for places over the next 18 months from the government. And so this is a chance to work really quite intensively with just a few places that are getting towns fund money. If you are interested, just email me, or you could even drop it into the chat. But we're recruiting for that right now, and that work will be starting in the next couple of weeks. And we'll be doing most of the work. You'll mostly be turning up to things and giving us feedback, which is always, I think, an easier way of doing things. So with all of that out there, let me hand over to Anna Valero. She's a senior policy fellow from the London School of Economics, and she's going to start her presentation for us. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you very much, Meg. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you've got the presenter view there.
That's perfect.
Thanks very much for inviting me to talk today. So I'm planning on sharing some work that we've been doing at the CP, working with colleagues at Grantham and What Works Centre on sustainable growth and green jobs. We've produced a series of papers in recent years on sustainable growth and more recently, obviously, recovery, where we've highlighted that there are significant economic opportunities and wider social societal co-benefits in the transition to net zero. And these can be realised if the appropriate set of policies are in place. And this includes not just environmental policies, obviously industrial, innovation, skills, all the related policies, accompanied by long-term institutions, which in turn will crowd in that private sector investment, accompanied by the necessary public sector investment. There's obviously a current focus on jobs now, including in the short term. This is largely due to the displacements that we've experienced due to the COVID-19 crisis, expected change due to Brexit, the net zero transition itself, and obviously technological change as it continues and has accelerated in many cases due to the crisis. But all of this has occurred against the background of stagnant productivity and real wages since the financial crisis. So there's a real need into the recovery for good quality, future-proof jobs and a just transition for those who will be displaced in all these different ways just mentioned. Many of the relevant policy levers are at the national level, so whether it's on the environmental side or in terms of national industrial strategies or growth plans or whatever the particular name given at a particular time is. These will obviously all be very important to the extent to which as a country we can achieve this improved economic growth model that is more sustainable and inclusive. But obviously the local level is key to implementing many of those policies and on climate action as well, as highlighted by PCAN and many others. And local policy levers and strategies and institutions will play an important role in realizing those benefits that we've been trying to identify in our work at the local level. So a way of thinking about this, quite soon as the crisis began to unfold last year, we undertook a series of Royal Economic Society webinars and then released a paper following that, which was really setting out the strategy, policies, and investments necessary for this kind of building back better, I guess, the sustainable recovery. And it really centered around the necessary investments we need in these 5 mutually enforcing areas, the different types of capital. There's infrastructure, knowledge and innovation, human capital, natural capital, and social capital. And clearly there are local elements across all of these areas. So on the infrastructure side, there's planning, transport, there's energy efficiency in buildings, whether that's in retrofits or new developments. In innovation, obviously we know there are local aspects to this in terms of clusters. There are strengthening linkages between key stakeholders, including universities, FE, and obviously this is a focus of government policy with the expected R&D place strategy. On human capital, clearly local elements there, and this is really where place-based elements will be quite important to understand the relative supply and demand of skills that are in demand or in declining demand, and what's the supply situation and how can that be addressed as we go into this new period post-pandemic. And obviously thinking about human capital in a broad sense, to think not only about skills but also other inputs like health and well-being, which in turn impact on productivity. On the natural capital side, there's restoration of ecosystems and preservation, planting trees, etc. And this is obviously important from the resilience perspective, but also, as I'll show, in terms of other jobs or co-benefits. And on the social side or societal side, this is really to do with developing a vision that can actually gain support and therefore be politically feasible. Because in a period of change, we really need to make sure that local communities and businesses are on board with this change. And this is important both in terms of on the political side, but also on the consumption side. And to do this, experience from transitions in other places has shown that participatory decision-making, anticipating change, and having forward-looking policies and mechanisms in place to deal with it are key for success here. So a paper that we released last year, we focused more on jobs. So we called it Jobs for a Strong and Sustainable Recovery. And in this paper, what we did was we considered a non-exhaustive list of what are considered shovel-ready investments, which are aligned with critical decarbonisation actions in the UK. And these are energy efficiency in buildings, natural capital projects, active travel equipment and infrastructure, renewable power and generation and distribution, EV production, charging infrastructure, and CCUS and hydrogen production. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to highlight that there are short-run job creation opportunities based on the evidence. So we did quite a holistic review of the evidence that is there, but as we'll see, there are many gaps in many places. So we looked at ex-post studies where available and ex-ante studies, kind of trying to understand who's done kind of rigorous forecasts of these different areas. And we presented indicative analysis of where such jobs could be located around the country based on initial endowments, together with some analysis of future growth potential. And what we found that based on the evidence that is available in the short term, forward-looking studies suggest that investments in clean automotive, CCUS and hydrogen, renewable energy and housing energy efficiency can each create about tens of thousands of high-wage jobs. We worked together with What Works Centre on a rapid evidence review on local green investment. So this is really back here. So the first 3 categories here, so energy efficiency in buildings, natural capital projects, and active travel equipment. And these are areas where clearly local investments are feasible. And the aim here was to really understand what is the evidence on the employment and wider benefits across these areas. And just in the table, there's some examples of the wider benefits in terms of on energy efficiency. So this is over and above the employment benefits of people actually doing these jobs. Obviously, reduced energy costs can increase consumption in local areas. There are health and well-being benefits for improved heating, reduction in indoor and outdoor air pollution. On the natural capital side, more attractive local areas can lead to increased tourism, for example, improvements in health and well-being and resilience to extreme weather events. And on the active travel side, reducing congestion, making places more livable with productivity implications, and obviously health benefits from reduced air pollution, increased exercise. So, in the discussion, it would be great to hear more from the What Works team on this, but what appears to be the case is there's a lack of robust evidence meeting the usual What Works Centre evaluation standards. So only 2 studies on energy efficiency met those usual standards. So what happened was a widening of the criteria to include 38 studies to estimate costs, benefits, and impacts, both on employment and health of these 3 investment types. In general, positive employment impacts were found, and they're often direct in terms of these are labor-intensive activities, and so jobs are related to construction or installation over the short to medium term. On the studies that kind of said, how many jobs per pound spent, the estimates range from about 7 jobs per $1 million to 50 jobs per $1 million. And basically, where available, the studies made comparisons and showed that green investments tend to generate more jobs than similar or comparable non-green investments. What the team concluded was that there's stronger evidence on health benefits. So, and another, in discussion with various stakeholders on this, including those working more in the health space, it's actually important to create more of a link between the two, between the health impact, the economic impact, and it goes both ways. A recent study that I'm sure many of you have seen that was just released by CBI Economics looks at clean air zones in cities, and it tries to use basically different academic estimates of impacts of improved air quality on health to estimate the kind of economic benefits that would imply in different cities. So one of the key findings in this evidence review is that the impacts vary according to local endowments, and this makes sense because the extent to which you need to invest in these areas depends on the situation you find yourself in. So in the jobs paper, what we did was for all of those categories, so those 3 in the What Works Centre evidence review, but all of the others we were considering as well, was we tried to think, okay, which geographic characteristics can give us an indication of where there might be real opportunities for investment and therefore jobs. And here are 3 on these 3 areas. So on energy efficiency, an easy way to do this is to look at the housing stock and say, okay, where does the housing stock need upgrades? On natural capital, the example here is tree planting potential, but other measures we considered also in the paper was the share of local area in wetlands and public parks. On active travel, a couple of ways we thought of looking at this was, okay, where are many cyclist casualties happening, which suggests that you could upgrade the infrastructure to improve it, to make it safer. But then on the flip side, it's where are the areas where there are actually low cycling rates. So for whatever reason, not many people are choosing to cycle, and maybe by improving that, there's the jobs associated with the infrastructure, but also the health benefits and reduced congestion as well. So in terms of, I'll just quickly touch on the other 2 areas we considered in the jobs paper on renewable power generation and distribution. Here there is much more evidence in the sense, these things have been discussed for quite a while, and because investments in renewable energy are at a much more advanced level, more can be said. And previous studies have shown that in the short run, renewable energy infrastructure is labor intensive and can create more jobs than investing in equivalent fossil fuel fired generation. In the longer run, while renewable energy requires less operation and maintenance labor, the argument is that energy cost savings resulting from greater energy efficiency can lead to net employment gains in the wider economy. And in our jobs paper, we set out some of the evidence for that. Here, when we wanted to do some geographic analysis, we simply said, okay, where are there pipeline projects? So areas where projects have been approved, the solar PV and wind. and where these are in place and where is the density of this relatively high. And clearly there are lots of local growth actions related to this. So even if some of the decisions are taken at national level, there's a lot of work to be done in terms of identifying and developing opportunities, growing related clusters and emerging technologies, and improving supply chain linkages. On EV production and charging in CCUS and hydrogen, here the ex-post evidence is even more limited. And this is largely because many of the relevant technologies are still developing and or deployment is not yet widespread. But we know that these are things that are going to be areas of growth going forwards. So when we were thinking about the potential geographically on EV, it's logical to consider where are the electric charging points currently and where are the places where the density is relatively lower. You can take that density as normalizing by people or by kilometers of road, and we did both. And on CCUS, here we just mapped out areas with high emitting industrial facilities in different sectors. In both of these areas, it's obviously a very fast-paced policy environment. On the EV side, in 2020, we produced a very detailed paper, we call it a deep dive, where we went into really in depth into the context of electric vehicles. I actually presented in a similar webinar series with the What Works Centre last year. We looked in detail at different reports, different methodologies for trying to estimate the opportunities, including carrying out some of our own analysis too on the job side. And we also presented some analysis on the innovation side and did a detailed review of policies. And what we really found there was that we are very reliant on the policy environment to actually make a success in the EV sector. We have a lot of strengths in the country, but other countries are doing a lot as well. And there are areas where we don't have that much comparative advantage currently. And clearly here, there are lots of local growth actions that are relevant in terms of on the demand side, standards or incentives for adoption, charge points and planning, fleet ownership in terms of local authority ownership, and support for EV sector clusters. On CCUS, again, there's been a lot of policy development here with recent government and UKRI announcements with 6 cluster plans which are being funded, and the local growth actions here are either leading or coordinating and working with partners in the development of these cluster plans. And what we're doing currently is another deep dive on CCUS, which will be a bit different in nature because it's obviously a much less developed industry than the car sector in the UK, but we want to go into much more detail in terms of the policies, in terms of the areas of strength and the geographic aspects of that in that paper. And I'll be very happy to chat to anyone who's interested or working on that going forward. So that was all looking more at the types of job creation opportunities in the short run from those shovel-ready investments. We also have done a number of pieces of work trying to understand where are the opportunities in the longer run. And we know that in countries like the UK, innovation is a key driver of growth. In our jobs paper, we used some trade data to show that in the medium to long run, there are several high-value, complex net zero line products which are quite close to our existing capabilities, and therefore it's reasonable to assume they could drive growth opportunities in the future. I'm not focusing on that here because it's using trade data and you can't do very disaggregated geographical analysis with it. So here I'm focusing more on the analysis we've done with patents to assess innovation potential. In a number of these papers, and including our next sustainable recovery paper, which we did last year, which we called Innovation for a Sustainable Recovery, we basically analyze patent data to compare the UK's strengths with other countries, to understand where the economic returns to R&D in specific areas could be high, and then to map this out geographically. And what we did was we focused on 2 key societal missions in this paper. So we have the general technology classes you can see in this chart, like pharmaceuticals, aerospace, etc. But we drew out those technologies that are clean and also highlight some of them individually, like ocean and wind at the top, you'll see there. And also we related technologies to COVID as well. So noting that the patent data are historical and COVID wasn't around during the time that these data relate to, we basically said which are the technologies that are to do with vaccines or medical issues or actually remote working technologies, which was what we called COVID supporting. So we basically, on an informed judgment, we said which of these technologies would be relevant in the COVID era on the medical side or on the being able to work given the COVID disruption side. And we found that the UK has relative technological advantage, which is basically comparing how we do versus the rest of the world. In COVID type technologies, specifically the more medical side, the COVID core technologies, and a number of clean areas, especially ocean energy and wind energy. And then when we look at the regional patterns of innovation, so where those patents are located across the UK, we concluded that because clean patents tend to be much more spread out, they're not just in the Golden Triangle, which is what we see more on the COVID side, you'll see in the middle map there. Because clean are more spread out, we concluded that support for these types of technologies, and we're really looking here at the benefits via spillovers as well, could actually have a role in levelling up. So this is an indicative analysis, but it suggests that the strengths are actually quite spread out. In terms of broad policy implications from all of this, there is evidence on the economic and broader opportunities in the transition to net zero in both the short and longer run. And we're still doing, there's much work to be done, and we're still working on a number of projects in the space. But realizing this will depend on the policies and incentives put in place now, and making sure that those policies and incentives and frameworks are long-term enough so that the private sector can understand and have reduced policy uncertainty in what is quite an uncertain world. In many cases, the technologies are not proven yet. In others, they are, and it's more about diffusion, but there is still a lot of innovation that needs to take place. The local opportunities will depend on local endowments and the interplay between national and local policy. Skills are likely to be key, and this really ties into the broader context of identifying green jobs and managing a just transition in light of both the COVID and Brexit shocks, which impact different places in different ways. And an excellent tool, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, is the PCAN Just Transition Jobs Tracker. And currently we're working with Nick Robbins, who worked on that at Grantham Institute, on basically identifying green jobs in an even more granular way, using the underlying occupational classifications that have been done in the US and mapping them to both EU and UK labour force survey data. We're also doing some work on job ads to understand where green jobs, where firms are advertising for green jobs, and what are some of the characteristics of those jobs. And finally, given what we've seen in terms of the evidence and the amount of activity that's going to be going on in this space going forwards, it's very important to build and share evidence on the impacts of green investments, considering the quantity and the quality of jobs that can be generated and other desirable outcomes, including health, well-being, as well as economic growth and all of their interactions. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Henry now.
Thanks, Anna. Yeah, Henry, do you want to? That was really, really helpful. Before Henry comes in, Anna, it's such a complicated topic, and it's so helpful to have you boil it down so that places can sort of get to grips with it, as if local authorities didn't have enough on their plates already. Henry, did you want to come in and give us some thoughts?
Yeah, sure. So I'm actually deliberately going to focus on the short to medium run stage of the recovery. And that's not really, I don't want to sort of preclude the wider discussion that we might have when we get to the sort of Q&A stage, because I think, as Anna said, decisions that we'll make today will matter for the next 5, 10, 15 years in terms of employment and other opportunities we generate locally as a result of green investments. But I guess sort of in the spirit of the recovery workshops, I thought that I should focus on the sort of shorter to medium run. And actually there, I do think that the active travel, energy efficiency and natural capital investment probably are the three sort of things where I see the most sort of immediate path to sort of short run policy actions. And I was just going to reflect a little bit on thinking about what we should, how we might think about prioritizing. I mean, as always with these things, I'm going to start sort of telling you where I think the evidence is and then sort of suggest what I think we should do. But of course, the evidence isn't quite as good as we would really like. So one of the real challenges here is that imagine I'm a local authority that wants to create some jobs. And I'm sitting and I'm thinking active travel versus energy efficiency versus natural capital investments. And it's very hard from the evidence to tell you which of these generates the most employment benefits, so the biggest bang for your buck. So we know that they're all going to generate local employment benefits. But the evidence, unfortunately, doesn't really tell us which of those sort of three broad areas of spend are going to generate most employment. I'd be interested to hear from people if they think they have evidence that is sort of particularly compelling about a sort of relative ranking of those. And the other real challenge in this space is, of course, it's fine to sort of say active travel, energy efficiency, and natural capital investment, but they in themselves are still quite big categories. And, if you're a local decision maker, you want to go in and start thinking about specific programs or projects within that. And there we struggle to find any evidence of the relative effectiveness of different types of active travel, energy efficiency, or natural capital. So I think, there are a couple of really major informational challenges that local areas place once they've sort of accepted that they want this to be part of their recovery planning. So, I mean, here are the things we do know, I think, in order to sort of start helping. I mean, one of the things I think we know is that actually, at least in the short to medium run, most of the jobs created are direct. So, and this is because they're relatively labor intensive. So actually, there is a sense in which, if you employ 100 people to go around installing EV charging points in light posts, as I noticed someone up the road from me doing just now. It only took them an hour. So I can't imagine that this is going to create a huge number of jobs. But, the direct employment effects of that are where most of the action is going to come. And, there's a problem with those direct employment impacts, which is that they're short to medium term. So they really are construction, manufacturing, and installation stage. And those kind of jobs aren't permanent. And we miss the long-term employment impacts. But of course, in the context of COVID recovery, actually those short-term job impacts really might be the things that we want to focus on. Now, you might sort of say, oh, well, what about the wider supply chains, etc.? I mean, some of those studies suggest that you'll get impact in the wider supply chains, but definitely the bulk of the effects were coming from the direct employment. Anna mentioned this. So I think, while it's fine to think about who's going to be providing the physical part of your active travel investments, I wouldn't let that particularly skew decisions as much as the direct employment impact. So, I guess it's another classic example of don't sweat the supply chain stuff too much relative to getting the short to medium term employment estimates correct. Something here that Anna, I think, would agree with, but is perhaps not such a problem in the medium to long run, but I think it is in the short run, is that if we want these employment benefits to come down to local residents, they've got to have the right set of skills for delivering on these policies. And Anna did actually mention this. She sort of said, we need to think about how those things link up. But that means that we need to reflect on how long it's going to take to acquire the kind of skills that we are talking about to deliver these. And I think that the skills relative to deliver some active travel investments will be, are different to the skills required for energy efficiency, different for the skills on natural capital. And it's also different how long it'll take to acquire those specific skills. So I think that if I was thinking about recovery and local employment effects, I would really be thinking, do I have the people and firms that can do this? And if I don't, how long would it take me to get them ready? If we're talking a year, that to me starts to be, in the current context, medium to long run industrial strategy type stuff, not short-term recovery. How am I going to get furloughed and unemployment people back into work? Let me just highlight something Anna said, because I also think that this is actually important, is that while the evidence base is weak on the employment impacts, other than sort of saying they're positive, the evidence is much stronger on the health outcomes. And I think that that has an important local policy message that I'll come to, and it's one that makes Anna slightly unhappy. So again, I think there'll be a chance to chat about it. I should say on those health outcomes as well that what's interesting is that most of them are looking at a pretty limited set of health impacts. So, for example, on active travel, it'll usually be respiratory related diseases, for example, that we look at, where it's kids and families being adversely affected by high particulate levels. We're not looking, for example, at mortality and the wider benefits of people being more able to work, etc. And Anna highlighted that those are only going to increase the health benefits of these kind of investments. So I think the evidence is really pretty strong on the healthy outcomes. And in fact, depending on the health outcome you want to target, we probably do have reasonable evidence there about what these different investments are going to do. So that brings me to another point in thinking about this. The local benefits of these things are going to vary, reflecting on different objectives and characteristics. So, there is a job for local areas to do in carefully assessing what are my objectives. I've been trying to set that up. Is it short-run employment, medium-run employment, long-run employment? Is it specific outcomes, health outcomes, or is it carbon? And I'll come back to that last question in a minute. Anna threw up some excellent maps. I'd be interested to hear if local areas have their own mechanisms for assessing their sort of endowments and the opportunities from these kind of things, because I imagine that places like would do. I think the one thing that's missing from that, and that I would be thinking about, is this flip side, which is the supply side. So are there local people and firms ready to offer these services, or that we could get ready in a relatively short period of time? That's not to criticize Anna, because of course over that medium to long run we can definitely do much more about skills. But if we're thinking about the sort of short-term recovery thing, I think that's an important question to ask. A few more minutes, Meg, is that okay, before we open up to questions? So one of the things I do think it's really important to do, and I know everyone's stretched, but I do think we need to do some work appraising local green investments. And I don't mean this here in a narrow BCR sense. I don't think it's the time really for doing that, although great if you want to. But I do think sort of really working through carefully the strategic case and mapping to objectives. Now, this is the bit, that might upset Anna. We'll see. But, if I was thinking about short-term recovery, I would, and given where we are with financial constraints, I would be absolutely focused on the local employment and the air quality and health benefits of residents more than carbon. And that's a controversial statement. The reason for it is twofold. A little bit to do with the evidence, which is, we know that that's where those benefits are going to come. But also a little bit to do with, although actually the news today on this is quite good, ironically, but, natural capital is the only one that tends to consider carbon. Actually, the active travel and energy efficiency investments don't really look at this in much depth. But national and international decisions are going to swamp anything local on carbon. And in a crisis, my personal feeling is that I would focus strongly short-term recovery funds on local employment, air quality and health of local residents. But that is a personal reading, and I'm interested to see whether people take a different approach. For what it's worth, this is important, I think. The active travel investments are those which appear to have the highest traditional BCRs. They have good employment impacts, they generate good health benefits, many of them go local. Natural capital is pretty good, although natural capital is the one that tends to add in carbon, and it's the adding in the carbon that often get them good. The other two tend not to. There is a real challenge with the energy efficiency investments, which is that for most of those energy efficiency investments, the results are mixed in the sense that the private benefit cost ratio still looks close to zero or possibly negative, even if the public BCR ratio is positive. And I'll come back to this in a minute, but what that means is somehow we've got to persuade households to do this. And as many of you on the call will know, that is an area where we faced major challenges. So I sort of hinted at the fact that I find the evidence on health most compelling and would tend to focus there. I mean, the other thing I would say from a local perspective is I really would focus on the direct employment impact. And I would use the new Green Book guidance, which just says use some simple multipliers to think about the indirect benefits. Don't pay consultants to do complicated input-output modeling exercise, etc. Anyone wants guidance on how to do that, get in touch, we can help them. So I think that's what I mean by sort of thinking about what the strategic case looks like for short and medium run. Let me just finish with a plug and then let's open it up to questions. We do really need more evidence. I think on both the local economic impact, please talk to us, we can help you. But I also think actually this is a space where we need more evaluations of policy effectiveness on narrower goals. So for example, I flagged it as I went through, how do we persuade firms to allow people in to retrofit their homes? I mean, that problem presumably has got worse, not better, as a result of COVID. And we know that the private BCRs are negative or not particularly positive. So we've got to do something to incentivize households to do it. And I think, again, this is an area where some experimentation and evaluation could be particularly valuable, given that our national scheme has just fallen over. So I hope that's useful in taking some of the stuff that great stuff that Anna gave us, and sort of thinking about how I would apply that locally, as well as, I mean, trying to be a bit controversial about what I would prioritise on the basis of the evidence. I'll stop there, Meg.
Thanks, Henry. If anyone has questions, please go ahead and put them into the chat, and I will ask them. There were a couple of things that I just wanted to ask about first. That one is about inclusive growth, and Henry and Anna, if either of you have any thoughts about which of these, how to manage, the inclusive impact of these things, so that we're perhaps focusing investments on the people who are suffering the most during the pandemic. Anna, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this is going to depend on the place-specific context in terms of which sectors have been most impacted or which demographic groups, etc. But it seems to me that any programs of job creation need to be accompanied, or the alternative being skills programs are really fundamental to this, because not only people have been displaced in this crisis, particularly the younger people will have lost out something in their work experience or in their educational experience, and we don't want these things to become longer term scars. So that really seems to be, I would say, a priority in terms of trying to improve social mobility and inclusive growth into the future. So really thinking about the people and the skills that they might need to transition into, in terms of some, as we've been discussing, the investments that might be made, but also in terms of if technological change or automation has particularly had an impact in a specific sector, which means that actually there is some level of reskilling that is needed anyway to be more resilient in the modern workplace. So that would be kind of a priority, I guess.
I mean, not much to add on Anna's point there. I sort of hinted at this as I went through. We know, for example, that the youth unemployment impact of the crisis has been very high. And so, thinking realistically about which of these green investments will generate employment for those young workers that have been displaced would be hugely important. Or I sort of said, which can we reskill in a relatively short amount of time? But, remember, again, there is, it's easy sometimes for us to sit here and say that, but there's a real policy challenge in trying to provide the right incentives to young people, especially people who might be very disillusioned as a result of what's just happened to them. Those youth scarring effects are, we have lots of evidence for that people graduating in a recession suffer long-term disadvantage. So, we are going to have to think about what incentives we can put in place or support, either to really help these people to retrain. And then make, let me just flag this, because when we get to the sort of second set of things that Anna was talking about, EV or carbon capture, etc., Anna was focusing on patents and sort of demonstrating that, the scope for some of those high skilled jobs to be spread out around the country. And while I think it's great to think that the green could spread, high skilled jobs around the country, I don't actually think that's the problem. I think the problem is generating employment opportunities for the lower skilled and the poorer families. And I think Anna's probably done some stuff on that, but there's a tricky challenge for our local industrial strategies there, as you know, which have a tendency to focus on those high-end, high-skilled, high-tech jobs, but not necessarily think about employment creation for the lower skilled workers. And I think, as we move towards the medium and long run, we'll need to do something to address that mismatch between the kind of jobs created here and the skilled level of local residents.
Thanks, Henry. I haven't had any questions come through, which I hope means that everyone's really listening and that everything is making sense. If I'm trying to figure out if I can get people to put up their hands. If anyone wants to ask anything now and you want to put up your hands, I think that would be fine, because we're at a number now where I think we could just about manage that. I've had something come through from Dragana Houston. Dragana, do you want to turn on unmute yourself? If you could turn on your camera, that would be great. And if you could tell us where you're from, and then please ask your question about jobs. I think it's a really good question about how many jobs are needed.
Hello, everybody. The camera's turning on, so hopefully you can all hear me okay. Thank you for the presentations. The question for me is I work for Swindon and Wiltshire LEP, and we have been talking about green jobs for a while now, but green jobs, we usually use it in quotation marks, or I do, because it's everything and anything depending on who you talk to. So just from your research and the work you've been doing, I was just wondering whether you've come across anything, any analyses or estimates that talk about the types of jobs and the volume of jobs, and then the skills within each that would be needed. So to kind of move us closer from talking high level to actually specifically looking at where we need to upskill, reskill. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so that's exactly the case. There isn't yet an agreed definition of what a green job is. We're actually currently doing some work on this. A number of different approaches have been taken, as I'm sure you've seen. So the narrow approach is to say, okay, green jobs are the jobs in kind of clean tech firms, constructing renewable energy, or other products and services that are in the green economy. A broader approach is to take the approach based on what's been done in the US on ONET, which is at the occupation level, where actually it was back in 2010. Basically, a team analysed occupations and consulted with experts and looked in depth at different types of jobs, and identified 3 types of green jobs, which they call new and emerging. Green, new and emerging, which is really those new people who are constructing a wind turbine and things like that. But then also green enhanced skills, so jobs that already exist, but the skills need to be enhanced as part of the transition to net zero. And then green increased demand, where actually the job doesn't change much, but those jobs are in more demand because of the transition. So that's a really useful analysis. And it was using this kind of analysis on the US labour market, which PCAN have recently released, and kind of applied it based on sectoral shares across local authorities. I think that's the level across the UK. What we're currently doing is taking those occupational allocations on the US and mapping them across using different conventions into EU and UK labour force survey data to, at a more granular level, say which are the jobs which are in those 3 categories, which are the non-green jobs that might be similar in some way to those green jobs, which says something about the differences in skills, etc. And then also to kind of understand the nature of those jobs. So how do they compare in terms of the education levels or how secure working arrangements tend to be, demographic characteristics, and basically anything that we can use. Training, for example, how much on-the-job training do green jobs versus non-green jobs tend to get? So this is kind of the next step of what we're doing. But if you want some useful references, the most granular analysis is done on the US because that's where all the classifications are consistent. And there they have actually done some quite detailed work where they really look at the skill content of some of these jobs and compare them to non-green jobs. But yeah, this should be coming out in the next few months. So certainly in time for COP. And it's a work program we're taking forwards in a number of ways, also looking at job ads, as I mentioned. So job ad is a good way to understand what's happening in terms of increasing demand in certain parts of the UK and how that's communicated in job ads, where you have quite a lot of information, usually on characteristics of the job and the type of background, applicants, etc. So you can ascertain skill levels.
Anna, I'm going to put you on the spot though. I mean, I'm not going to hold you to it, but what are we talking? I mean, so either give us the US numbers as a percentage of the US labour force, in which case it might vaguely translate across, or else if you're willing to, you know, give us tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, etc. for the UK.
Well, what I can say is in the US it was around 20% of the labour force, in this kind of broad way of thinking about it. And then there's a similar exercise was then carried over to the EU, where about 40% of jobs were considered to be green in the broad sense. So you end up with much more than the narrow sense. The narrow sense is like the ONS Low Carbon Renewable Energy Survey, economy survey, which takes, you know, which are the jobs that are really green because it's working in some green technology, as I said before, and then you get about 1 to 2% of jobs. So these approaches, I think, are useful because they take a broader occupational lens to this. And it is true that once the transition is over, you know, hopefully soon, all jobs will be green because everything will be in a decarbonized economy. So there's also the other aspect, which is thinking about just some jobs are green by their nature, and we are quite a service sector intense economy. So you have to think also more broadly in terms of sectoral shifts when you're thinking about carbon footprint of jobs.
Yeah, I suppose what worries me, not worries me, but, you know, being realistic, we haven't actually done it, Meg, and perhaps we should. I don't think the employment numbers in active travel, natural capital, and energy efficiency would look that big. I mean, you know, I think there are things where, you know, they're probably in your tight definition, Anna, right? Those three things, and that, you know, and there's some subset of them. So I suppose that's why I also think that it's important to emphasize the health benefits of those kind of things in the background of which we've just had a major health crisis as well as employment crisis. My reading of the short run investments is that the health case will be really strong relative to the employment case for the narrow set of investments relative to the broader set. I think what you've just said probably
I think that's true, and I think that's why we need to think about the wider co-benefits on people, their health and their well-being, which then will increase, or should, based on the evidence, increase productivity and the strength of local economies in that sense. And also the interaction of COVID with this as well, because what we've seen is there's scientific evidence that air pollution is bad for health. And also there seems to be some evidence that's come out that people exposed to more air pollution were more susceptible to COVID. So there's a lot of interactions with this. And I think actually emphasizing those health benefits and making them better understood by communities is a key part of actually making the implementation of the transition to net zero more popular and feasible politically. Understanding that there are costs and thinking about mechanisms, as you said, to address barriers to some of these things, because there are barriers to, especially things that involve a high upfront cost or disruption somehow to day-to-day life. But if people understand better why this is actually good for them and their families and their communities, then it increases the likelihood of success.
Anna, can I ask you about something else, which is a thing that I know that local authorities sometimes struggle with, which is about, you're talking about the local endowments and understanding what your local endowments are. Are there Are there good methods or sources of data that can help places understand where they fit in kind of the national picture in terms of what their local conditions are?
Well, I think that the data that we used for the jobs paper, as I said, that was an indicative analysis. We did that paper quite quickly last year. But those are the types of geospatial data sets that you can really get a handle of the stocks of various things. So all the data on energy efficiency in buildings is available. So you can look at that. You can look at the relative energy efficiency in the housing stock in different parts of the country. And I think the next step I always felt with that would be to then say, okay, so how many jobs, and I think some of this analysis will have been done for sure by the government or others, but given a certain stock of housing that needs to be upgraded, how many people can do that in a period of however long? And so actually translating that into jobs using the best available data seems to be an important next step. And similarly with all the others as well, you know, if there is an intention for some pre-planting, how many people do you need per square kilometer, for example? Like, just that's the next level of the types of calculations that I think make sense, and they will vary by local characteristics.
And Meg, in terms of understanding who is currently unemployed, so coming back to that sort of shorter run thing, I don't know if Victoria's on the call, but obviously we're hoping to put this data piece out in the next couple of weeks on sort of short run indicators. I don't know, I think Victoria is here, so I don't know whether she can jump in, but I don't know if there's anything there that would be good for really, you know, that immediate timely data on who's unemployed, who's employed, what their skill distribution, etc. looks like. Victoria, do you want to say something on that?
Yeah, so as Henry says, we have written a paper which is about how to use data to help plan your COVID recovery as a local area. So we're hoping that it will go live on our website at some point next week. What we've done is we've looked at a range of different data sources that we think will be useful. There are some things that we would like to be able to signpost to, but where the kind of, you know, timely real-time data doesn't exist. One of the aspects that we've looked at is labour market data. So we've made a number of suggestions there in relation to both national statistics, so things like the claimant count and the regional labour market data that comes out, administrative data, so there's still data coming forward in relation to, for example, people who are on the coronavirus job retention scheme. So, you know, and there is a little bit of a breakdown in that in terms of age and gender, and actually now some at sectoral level as well for regions. And also the other thing we're signposted to are some resources around vacancy data. I think it can be interesting to monitor what's happening in terms of the type of vacancies within your local area. So, you know, it covers other things too. It talks about mobility data, it talks a little bit about kind of business indicators, but we should hopefully have it up on the website next week.
Thanks, Victoria. Helen from Bristol, did you want to ask your question, please? If you unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself, Helen, or do you want me to ask it? We can't hear you, Helen, so I'm going to go ahead and read your question, which is about the cities and local growth unit commissioning us to run these workshops, but yet we don't seem to have a lot of evidence to actually tell places what they could be doing. And she was asking, is there a group of local authorities that we're working with who are making these kinds of investment decisions to gather the data? And given the fact that the time is so short, it's going to be tricky to get that kind of data out ahead of things. I think we're all in experimental mode to a certain extent. But Henry or Victoria, did you want to say anything about that? Because I know it's very frustrating.
Yeah, I mean, look, Helen, it's always a challenge, and it's even more of a challenge in COVID times for policy, you know, this set of policies. So, you know, like so many of the areas that we look at, the evidence base isn't great for us being able to point at particular policies and say, do this, do that. I just urge people, if they're doing stuff in this space, I mean, I sort of hinted at it at the end, you know, if you're doing stuff in this space and there's things we could do to help to understand the effectiveness of the things that you are trialing or putting in place, please get in contact. You know, because I think the best we can do at this stage, I can't sort of magic the evidence, but the thing we can do is at least work with places and feedback from what we are seeing. Because, I mean, actually, as Anna has hinted, I think these questions are immediate in a recovery sense, but I don't think they're going away. So, you know, I think it's unfortunate that, you know, it's hard for us to say do X, Y, or Z. But you'd like to think that in the next year, lots of people will be trying X, Y, and Z. And if people, you know, can get in contact with us, we can talk to them about how they monitor or evaluate the impact of those different things. And we'll be in a better position in a year's time. You know, the less optimistic version, well, I think the realist in me thinks these will still be live issues in a year or 2 years, because even actually, if we do the home insulation, the next challenge is going to be how we get people to switch their heat sources. So, you know, and even if we do some active travel this year using Towns Fund or other type investments, it'll be a drop in the ocean relative to what's required. And similarly, actually, for the natural capital. You know, we've got, for example, major ambitions around tree planting. I don't think they will be delivered within the next fiscal year. And so questions about how to deliver those policies are going to stay live for the next several years. So I think I just urge people, you know, we have lots of resources in place to support people. Victoria, I notice you've just unmuted yourself, so hopefully you're going to tell people what they might be. But hopefully, Helen, you know, I can't do much retroactively to magic up evidence, but we've done our best to pull together everything there is. We're very keen to encourage places to work with us over the next year or so to try and improve the evidence base.
So I was just going to come in to add to that, which is Henry is right. We don't know very much about this particular topic, but there are other things we know. So, you know, we have our employment training, evidence review and toolkits, you know, so we know quite a lot, you know, so basically a lot of what we've talked about so far is this is going to create jobs. You know, they're not necessarily going to be extremely high skilled jobs. We've got, you know, challenges around unemployment and particularly youth unemployment, where we think actually a lot of those young people could be deployed to do this work. You know, so we do have an evidence base around, you know, what works in terms of employment training, and we distilled some of that into a paper on youth unemployment last year. Similarly, Henry's touched on the fact that a lot of this stuff longer term is going to be about behaviour change. Now, we don't tend to focus particularly on behavioural change, but the Behavioural Insights team has done lots of work on that issues. So I think it's the, you know, even if we don't necessarily have lots of evidence on the impact of green investments on jobs or other economic outcomes, there are other pieces of evidence that I think we can draw on to make sure that if we're going to make these kinds of investments, we maximise the benefits of them for local areas.
Actually, the one thing I should add on top of that, Helen, is that in order to kind of make this interesting, we haven't gone through the boring detail of what each of the policies say, but if you go to the underlying evidence review, there is a summary for each of the 38 papers that will give you much more detail on what the scheme did and what the benefits look like. I'm just cautious of jumping from analysis of one scheme to, yes, I should implement that scheme. But, you know, for those of you on the ground, you know, who are trying to do something, you know, that might be something that you're more willing to countenance. So I think there are 38, Annie, I think you said the number, there are 38 studies. A lot of them aren't UK based, but, you know, I think there's still opportunities to learn by looking abroad. And in each of those, we provide a summary of what the evidence says. And then I think if you're interested, you can go and get the freely available underlying reports and look in more detail. So I think, you know, there is more evidence out there, more detailed evidence out there on specific schemes than I sort of was interested in covering in an hour-long talk. But the paper itself, you know, has 20 pages of discussion, and if people can't find it on the web page, you know, contact us and we'll point you in the right direction.
Thanks, Henry. We have another question from Dragana, which I think is also a good one. If you want to ask your question, Dragana, about the Green Jobs Task Force, and if you could say a bit about what you've done with the Green Jobs Task Force, that would be really interesting as well.
I'm now starting to feel bad because I keep asking all the questions.
That's good.
I was just wondering whether there's been anything that's come out of the Green Jobs Task Force, because I know that they were supposed to be doing the discovery up until January, and I haven't seen or heard anything since November when they had their first meeting.
I haven't seen something being published. I was involved in some of their workshops, but yeah, I mean, there might be something out that we haven't seen, but I can't. A quick Google now, I can't see any news.
I was Googling it, which I think answers your question about whether there's anything.
I think we'd have heard probably if there was some new report out.
Unless someone's going to correct us, I'm pretty sure I haven't seen anything. Victoria, I don't think. I mean, we were doing to be fair to them. I can't remember when we published the green green recovery paper. It was a few months ago. So, you know, if they publish anything in the last couple of months, it's possible we might have missed it. But I don't think I've seen anything.
I don't think I've been looking for it, looking out for it, so I haven't seen anything. And I think what we've locally been thinking is that, you know, depending on what the Green Jobs Task Force comes up with, we've kind of been holding off doing our own local research and duplicating some of that work, because, you know, we might have slightly different volume and needs in different locations, but it's going to be the same types of jobs and it's going to be the same types of skills. So there would be a lot of overlap across the country if everybody did their own bit.
Meg, we should try and find out.
Yeah, we'll look at that.
Let's get Danny to try and find out where things are. That's our head of policy.
Yeah. I'd like to ask places, I haven't had any more questions come in, but if anyone would like to give us a bit of feedback while you're here, I mean, I'd be really interested to hear from places. Oh, sorry, Tim, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Nice to see you again, Anna. And I've really enjoyed the discussion. And I guess, I'm from Thames Valley Berkshire Local Enterprise Partnership, so I'm the second LEP to ask a question today. And one thing that's kind of struck me during the conversation is whether we're trying to solve two different problems at the same time. Because, you know, as a LEP, we've published a recovery and renewal plan, as all LEPs have been required to do. We've focused on short-term, medium and long-term. And as you know, contributors have said, the short-term need is to get people, and especially young people, back in touch with the labour market. You know, that is a critical priority for the point that Henry made about the sense of disillusionment that comes for young people when they're detached from the labour market. And, you know, we're also talking about the green needs of the economy and the sustainable needs of the economy. And, you know, I think if we are trying to ensure that every job we create fits into that sustainable model, which we would like to do in an ideal world, but we're making the job a bit too tough for ourselves if we try to do that. And maybe we should kind of think about them in a slightly different way. I'm wondering if, and this is kind of more a reflection, but Henry and Ella might have any thoughts. I'm wondering if we need to think again about the benefits system, because there's a French economist, Philippe Aghion, who's just published a book called Creative Destruction. And I've been thinking about this in terms of our own work at the LEP. he says that the most innovative firms are small firms, and the most innovative firms create a lot of jobs quickly and then discard a lot of jobs quickly. So the job turnover is quite high. And so we've got this kind of dilemma that we want more innovative firms, but we also want firms that provide kind of long-term employment, and they do one or the other. And I'm just wondering if young people moving into the labour market and out of the labour market, which is not ideal, but it's better than being completely detached from the labour market. And if a benefit system somehow could support them, at least to stay in touch with the labour market in terms of short-term jobs. And I know that's wider than the panel have been talking about, but that's just kind of something that's been striking me as the conversations have been going on. And if Anna has any evidence about how the renewable energy creates short-term jobs, but so the money it saves in the long term can create more jobs in the economy, I'd be interested to see that, because I think that's quite a tough sell. You know, the story of globalization seems to me that, you know, good jobs, except for the very, very high skilled people, become more and more difficult to create. And you know, I'm not sure that people are sold on the idea that creating short-term jobs in renewable energy and the money saved will create a lot of jobs elsewhere, unless we can demonstrate that that's the case. Sorry if that was a bit of a ramble, Meg, but just been thinking while people have been speaking.
Yeah, that's all interesting. Anna?
Yeah, great to see you, Tim. I think you're right that they're two different problems, but I think the reason that we use the word sustainable in our reports rather than just clean or green is because we actually want to be broader than clean or green. And we want jobs that can, or we want growth that can be sustained. And so even if a job isn't clean, if it's something that is, you know, the skill set, the future trajectory of that particular occupation is something that can be sustained into the future, then surely that is kind of a good job. And part of that would be that it's not in a fossil fuel burning kind of firm or something. But I think, you know, that broader sense of sustainability can help. Sometimes using clean or green can just be a bit too narrow. In terms of, I can send you the paper that had a few references on the renewable energy side. But I think really what's happening in renewable energy, which is a powerful part of the entire story, and that's where we've seen the benefits of technological change and innovation, in the sense that the costs of these technologies have come down so much. And, you know, the kind of narrative is that this happened without even that much policy commitment, because it's been happening over a period that there haven't been these stringent legislated net zero goals that we're now seeing. So if that was all possible in recent years, imagine what could be possible now. And if that kind of innovation happens and technologies become cheaper, then you then get all the knock-on impacts into the economy due to cost savings and increased spending on other things and increased demand. So I think just thinking about those jobs in terms of jobs that are fit for the future, and that ties into the whole debate about digital skills and the sectors that have a future as well.
I mean, I will, I actually tend to agree with you, Tim, as well. I think there are two separate problems. I think let me just, I don't really want to finish on a dismal note, but I think what slightly worries me is that a year ago when we had a green event, there were lots of people on the call who were quite optimistic about, you know, COVID changing people's values and people, you know, enjoying the quiet and the quieter streets, etc. And I remember being a little bit worried then that, you know, if the crisis was really deep, a lot of that, you know, wouldn't it be nice to have a green recovery would go away, and the pressure would really be, let's focus on jobs. And I think the longer it's gone on, the more I think that's there. You know, so look, I mean, I sort of follow the debates. We've got a new economy 2030 project, which we've just launched, which is a thing between the Centre for Economic Performance, where I also spent some time, in the Resolution Foundation. And, you know, we're just sort of pulling together the launch document for that. And one of the things we were reflecting on was we've done lots of the adjustment, for example, on aviation. But all of the policy is about getting aviation levels back now. It's not taking the new lower levels of flying and thinking what policies we could do to perpetuate those and reduce the carbon footprint from flying. you know, all of the pressure has come on, oh my goodness, how are we going to get the aviation sector back and financially viable? I think we're going to see that on lots of things, unfortunately. I think the bounce back numbers on road traffic look awful. And
so that's where you have the conflict between the carbon budget and the commitments we've made with some of the current policy pressures maybe coming from certain sectors or industries. So I guess just because that's happening, it doesn't mean that those changes don't need to occur.
yes,
we do need to reduce the volume of flights, and we've made commitments to that. I
agree. I agree. I guess I'm just reflecting on the fact that I'm no longer confident it's easier than it was a year ago. I think I sometimes worry it's going to be harder, you know, because there will be pressure to get people back into employment as quickly as possible. I'm not going to say anything on Philippe, but Tim, he's giving a public lecture on the 4th of May at LSE. So if anyone's interested in seeing what he's doing, that's free and open to all, and I'm sure it'll be great. So I encourage you to go and put your Philippe Papillon question to him.
Thanks, Henry, and thanks, Tim. It's a really beautiful day here, so I'm going to suggest that we finish up early and people can go for a walk around the block before their next meeting starts. Before we do, I just wanted to ask Victoria if there's anything that you want to say by way of wrapping up, and also just by reminding people of some of the things that we can do to help them grapple with these issues.
Okay, yes. I think what we've heard from Anna and Henry is that there will be economic opportunities from net zero. And that if we're thinking about the short term or the short to medium term, and we're also thinking about which of them are going to play out at the local level, that it's most probably active travel, energy efficiency, and natural capital that have the greatest potential. I think one of the most kind of interesting things that Henry touched on is that actually in terms of decision making, at the local level, we must probably want to be focusing on the impacts on local jobs and on air quality. But as Anna touched on, local endowments are going to vary, and therefore actually the scale and the scope and the nature of the benefits and impacts that you'll be able to get are going to vary depending on what your area looks like, what your endowments are like. I think there's probably a couple of things that came out that I think are really, really key. One is the importance of skills. You know, even if we're able to make investments in these areas and they create jobs, and as Henry touched on, you know, these are unlikely to be, you know, very high skilled jobs. You know, and that's a good thing in this sense, because actually it's the lower to medium skill jobs that we struggle more with in terms of creating. You know, just because the jobs are there doesn't necessarily mean that local people are going to be able to take them up. So we really need to be thinking about the skills and how we develop those skills as soon as possible, so that we've got people to be able to feed in. And I think the other thing that really came through quite clearly is a lot of the questions were about, to what extent do we know how many jobs there are going to be, or what the nature of those jobs are going to be, or other aspects, you know, of what the likely trajectory of these sectors are going to be. So I think there's a really interesting question there about how, as a community collectively, we can try to understand more. And just to kind of reiterate, I can't remember whether Meg said this or Henry said this, that, or possibly both, you know, that we're here to support. So both in terms of, we've got an evidence, you know, base. So if there are things in that you would like to come talk to us, we're always happy to do that. But also, if you're thinking about doing a project in this area and evaluating it, we'd be really interested in hearing from you, because, you know, we're, over the next few years, one of our big areas of work is that we want to try and expand the community of people across local government and local enterprise partnerships who are engaged in actively evaluating their policy. So do give us a shout if there's something that you think we could potentially work on together.
Thanks, Victoria. Just to say, I'd like to say a big thank you to Anna for joining us. It was really great to hear you present your own work. There's so much detail in there. And we will hopefully be able to send some slides around after this. Our next event is on the 27th of May, and that's about high streets. If anyone has any feedback on this session, or again, needs any help with their work, please do get in touch. My email and Victoria's email are both on our website at whatworksgrowth.org. Thanks very much, and have a good rest of the day.